What an immense privilege it is for each and every one of us to be able to come before our God to worship Him this morning. Truly, as we have sung songs of praise to Him, to glorify His name and encourage one another, and brought our petitions before His throne, and remembered His Son. I appreciate so much the words that Mike Bryant spoke before we partook of the Lord's Supper together. I think we saw, if we were focused, we saw Jesus from His head, His hands, His feet, sorrow and love flow mingled down. Did e'er such love and sorrow meet, or thorns compose so rich a crown? Were the whole realm of nature mine, that were a present far too small. Love so amazing, so divine, demands my soul, my life, my all. Let us be in the moment of worshiping Him even now. Let us keep our minds focused on what it is that we're doing and who it is that we're glorifying as we think about His word together for a while. And let us ever live in the moment of glorifying our God. Our lesson this morning asks this question: would you be persuaded if someone rose from the dead? Would you be persuaded to believe what you're supposed to believe, teach what you're supposed to teach, do what you're supposed to do, if someone rose from the dead to tell you what it is you're supposed to believe and teach and do? A lot of folks won't believe the truth, and they won't believe it no matter what. In Luke chapter 16, there's this tremendous story that Jesus tells that we often use to sort of try to figure out what happens in the afterlife. That's the main reason that we go to the story of the rich man and Lazarus, but I'm not sure that's the main point of the story. Because what you see in this story is the difference between a man who suffered in this life and a man who was selfish in this life, and the eternal consequences of the kinds of lives that they live. Both men die, and Lazarus goes and is in paradise, in Abraham's bosom. And the rich man, he dies and he opens his eyes and he's in torment. And he sees Abraham far off across a great gulf, and you know the story. Send Lazarus to dip the tip of his finger in water and cool my tongue, for I am in anguish in this flame. And Abraham explains to him, son, it can't happen. There's a great gulf fixed between where you are and where we are. Nobody can cross over. Lazarus is getting the reward of his life, and you are getting the reward of your life. What you're experiencing is a consequence of the way you lived. Yet the rich man realizes, he says, I've got 5 brothers that are still alive on earth. Send somebody to tell them. He says, I beg you therefore, Father, that you would send Lazarus, him, to my father's house. He says, I have 5 brothers. This is verse 28 of Luke chapter 16. I have 5 brothers, that he may testify to them, lest they also come to this place of torment. But Abraham said to him, they have Moses and the prophets, let them hear them. And he said, no, Father Abraham, but if one goes to them from the dead, they will repent. He knew that he should have repented. He knew that his brothers should repent, the ones that were still living. He wanted somebody to rise from the dead to go tell them. But Abraham then says, if they do not hear Moses and the prophets, neither will they be persuaded, though one rise from the dead. That is a powerful statement. It's a powerful statement that gets to the obstinacy of unbelief, where a person doesn't believe because they don't want to believe. And it doesn't matter what God does or has done or will do. It doesn't matter what supernatural acts of God are presented in this world. It doesn't matter the fact that you wake up every morning and see God's creation and the wonder of His power surrounds us every moment. And that there's no excuse for not believing in Him. Paul says in Romans chapter 1, we are without excuse if we choose to ignore and fail to recognize the power of God that's clearly seen in creation. Yet there are those that don't believe him, don't even believe he exists. And there's no excuse for not believing his word. There have been a lot of unbelievers over the years, over the centuries in which humankind has lived on this earth. A lot of unbelievers who had no reason for their unbelief. Think of the Israelites, all that they had witnessed as God delivered them through Moses' hand out of the bondage of Israel. The 10 plagues, just any one of the 10 plagues, an amazing, should have been any one of them, should have been an event where anybody who witnessed it would have said, you know what, there's a God in heaven and Moses is his spokesman, and I need to listen to what God is saying through Moses, and whatever God says through Moses, I am going to do. Just you pick any one of the 10 plagues. And then you go on and they're delivered from Egyptian bondage, and they pass through the Red Sea in this tremendous miracle, God delivering them from the armies of Pharaoh, and they get to Mount Sinai, and they see all that occurs there, all of the wonders of God, so much so that they quake in fear. And God tells them, I'm going to give you this land. He sends 12 spies into the land, and 10 come back and say, oh, we can't take it. We don't believe God. Can you imagine? We don't believe God. After all that they've seen, all that they'd experienced in the way of what was supernatural, we don't believe God. And throughout the scriptures, of course, many times, Deuteronomy chapter 1, several times in the book of Hebrews, other places as well, it's clear to us that they were not allowed to enter the promised land, the Hebrew writer says, because of their unbelief, because they were obstinate in their unbelief. All that they'd seen, all of the miracles, we still don't believe it. We just don't want to believe it, and that's the problem. In John chapter 12 and verse 37, Jesus did a lot of miracles when he was on this earth. Healed a lot of sick people, raised the dead, walked on water, fed the 5,000, fed the 4,000. Tremendous miracles. And yet in John 12 and verse 37, John observes that though he had done so many signs before them, they did not believe in him. Here are people who didn't believe even though they'd seen people come back from the dead. Even though they'd seen Jesus do all these tremendous and supernatural feats. What would it have taken? What would it have taken to get you to believe if you were an Israelite? Would you have believed, when the water turned to blood? Would you have believed that the plague of the flies or the lice or the death of the firstborn? Or at what point would you have said, you know what? God is God and Moses is his spokesman, and I need to be listening, and I need to be believing and doing what I'm being told here? And at what point had you lived as an Israelite in the first century and followed among the multitudes who saw Jesus perform miracle after miracle after miracle? When he started out turning the water to wine, had you seen that in John chapter 2? And not too long later, when in Capernaum, healing a leper, healing Simon Peter's mother-in-law, and on we go. At what point would you have finally said, this individual, the widow's son at Nain, coming out in a funeral procession, and he raises the widow's son from the dead. Maybe then you'd have thought, this really is the Son of God. And I need to believe in him. And I need to listen to what he's saying. What's going to take for us? What's it going to take for us to really, really believe in Jesus and really decide that we are going to do what he has said for us to do? That we trust him that much. Of course, the thing is, someone did rise from the dead. The rich man's brothers, they wouldn't have believed had they seen Jesus rise from the dead. The Israelites in the wilderness, I don't think they'd have believed either. They saw all kinds of stuff. The Jews of Jesus' day, they didn't believe. But the point is, somebody has risen from the dead, hasn't he? And we have a lot of evidence about that. There's no reason to doubt it, really. There's a tremendous amount of evidence that Jesus came back from the dead. And I want to think with you for just a few minutes now about that reality, that someone did rise from the dead. Peter argues the point very powerfully in that sermon in Acts chapter 2. So many powerful things are said in that lesson. But notice in Acts chapter 2 and verse 29, after he quoted from David about David said, you will not leave my soul in Hades, nor will you allow your Holy One to see corruption. Peter says in verse 29, men and brethren, let me speak freely to you of the patriarch David, that he is both dead and buried, and his tomb is with us to this day. So David couldn't have been talking about himself, Peter says, but he says, being a prophet and knowing that God had sworn with an oath to him that of the fruit of his body according to the flesh, he would raise up the Christ to sit on his throne. He, foreseeing this, spoke concerning the resurrection of the Christ, that his soul was not left in Hades, nor did his flesh see corruption. This Jesus God has raised up, of which we are all witnesses. Here's the claim that Peter makes on the day of Pentecost. He says, first of all, we've got an empty tomb. David's body's still in his tomb in Peter's day. They could have gone and opened it up, and yep, there's a skeleton. But Jesus, who had died a scant 7 weeks before, his body's not in his tomb. And besides that, we all are witnesses. And I think Peter there is referring to the apostles who are standing before this crowd on the day of Pentecost. We all saw. It's an undeniable thing that Jesus was raised from the dead. And this isn't a lesson about all of the evidence for the resurrection of Christ, but it's what Peter presents on that day, isn't it? Here's the fundamental point, folks. Somebody came back from the dead. And here's what he said. After he came back from the dead, he said, go into all the world and preach the gospel to every creature. Do we believe we need to be doing that? Are we doing that? That command given to the apostles, I realize, involves several specifics. We should be concerned about the salvation of all the world. No place is to be left out. No people are to be shunned or avoided. We're to preach the gospel, not ourselves, not human wisdom, not philosophy, not the current thoughts of the Pope. We're to preach the gospel. And we're to do so to every creature. And we're to preach what the person who came back from the dead said, is that we're to preach that he who believes and is baptized will be saved, and he who does not believe will be condemned. Do we believe that this is the formula for salvation? That's what the person who came back from the dead said. He said that you're to believe and be baptized. The person who believes and is baptized will be saved. Not the person who believes, is saved, and can be baptized later. That's not what he said, is it? Why don't we believe what he said? Why doesn't the religious world believe what he said? What's it going to take to get the religious world to believe what Jesus said about what to do to be saved? Somebody says, well, if somebody came back from the dead, they'd believe he already did come back from the dead. That's what he said when he came back from the dead. What's it going to take? That's what he said. Twist that around all you want, follow religious leaders of the world. But here's what the person who came back from the dead said. He also said in Matthew 28:18-20, after he gives the commission there to his apostles, telling them to go into all the world, make disciples. He says in verse 20, teaching them to observe all things that I have commanded you, and lo, I am with you always, even to the end of the age. Now here's something. Jesus said, the person who came back from the dead said this, apostles, you go out, I've got all authority, I'm sending you out with my authority, and you teach everybody to do what I've taught you to do. All things that I've commanded you, apostles, you teach as you make disciples of all nations. As we look back over what Jesus taught then in Matthew, Mark, Luke, and John, what the person who came back from the dead said is, you teach and believe all of that I've already taught. That's what you're supposed to be teaching and believing. And of course, there was more that he sent the Spirit to give them as well. We understand that. But I want to go back with you in the most maybe simple, so simple that it's virtually simplistic. But I want you to go back in the Gospel of Matthew. Matthew, ends by saying, Jesus saying, the one who rose from the dead, saying, teach them everything I've taught you. Well, some of the first teaching of that Jesus did in the Gospel of Matthew is found in Matthew chapter 5 in what we call the Sermon on the Mount. And I just want you to notice a few things really quickly with me in the Sermon on the Mount. In Matthew 5, verses 23 and 24, if you bring your gift to the altar and there remember that your brother has something against you, leave your gift therefore before the altar and go your way. First be reconciled to your brother and then come and offer your gift. Do you believe that? Or are you sitting here trying to worship God this morning with something against a brother? What would it take to get you to go fix what's wrong between you and your brother before you come to worship? Somebody going to have to rise from the dead to tell you to go do that? Somebody did. You going to believe it or not? Verse 25, agree with your adversary quickly while you're on the way. No, I want to argue with him all the way and disagree with him and hold it against him for the rest of my life. The person who rose from the dead said, agree with your adversary quickly. Don't be obstinate. Don't be disagreeable. Try to get along with folks. That's what the person who rose from the dead said to do. Chapter 5, verse 28, I say to you, whoever looks at a woman to lust for her has already committed adultery with her in his heart. Reckon pornography is okay? I've known people to actually try to rationalize some way or another why pornography is okay. Even Christians. I know what the person who rose from the dead said. I know what he taught. And I know what I'm supposed to believe about that. In verse 32, I say to you, whoever divorces his wife for any reason except sexual immorality causes her to commit adultery. Whoever marries a woman who is divorced commits adultery. The world does not believe that. But somebody rose from the dead to let us know that that's the way it is. And we could go on. Verse 39, don't resist an evil person. Whoever slaps you on your right cheek, turn to him the other also. Is that what we do? You believe that's what you ought to do? Or should you smash him in the mouth? What are you supposed to do? You're supposed to get him back? I tell you, do not resist an evil person. Whoever slaps you on the right cheek, turn to him the other also. If anyone wants to sue you and take away your tunic, let him have your cloak also. Whoever compels you to go 1 mile, go with him 2. Give to him who asks, and from him who wants to borrow, from you do not turn away. Powerful challenges about the way we are to live our lives. I believe, and I hope you believe, that's the way you're to live your life. Because somebody came back from the dead and said so. And in verse 44, I say to you, love your enemies. Bless those who curse you. Do good to those who hate you, and pray for those who spitefully use and persecute you. Friends and brethren, we are living in a world where more and more and more we as Christians are going to have enemies. They're going to be our enemies because we are Christians. They are saying, even now, vile things about us in this society. People even who used to tolerate, and I use that term advisedly, Christianity, are no longer tolerating Christianity. And more and more and more, we will find those who are our enemies in this world. What are we going to do about it? We're going to hate them back. We're going to use their own tactics against them. What do you believe we ought to do? You know what I believe we ought to do? Love them. Bless them. And pray for them. The war that we're in, the spiritual war that we're in, is not going to be won by using the tactics of Satan. But it will be won by the power of the cross, by people who are crucified with Christ, and who are willing, even though they may be crucified or beheaded in their very last moment, to say with Jesus Christ to those who are enemies of enemies, forgive them, for they know not what they do. Somebody rose from the dead to tell us what to believe about those things. What are we going to believe about the second coming? In Acts chapter 1, verses 6 and 7, after he'd risen from the dead and just prior to his ascension, they come together, the apostles, with Christ, and they ask him, saying, Lord, will you at this time restore the kingdom to Israel? And he said to them, it is not for you to know the times or the seasons which the Father has put in his own authority. Now, this isn't the only place in the Scriptures that Jesus says something like this, but basically, we don't know the times or the seasons when, God's going to do whatever he's going to do in the future. They didn't understand really about the establishment of the church, the kingdom, but they sure didn't understand about the second coming of the Lord, although he taught them some things about that. But nobody knows the day or the hour or the time or the season when the Lord might come again. We had Jeff May and I have been at Fiddler's Convention the last couple of days, sharing a couple of books that we wrote about spiritual things. Had a lot of interesting conversations with a lot of interesting people over the last couple of days. One man wanted to talk about the rapture. Another man wanted to know if we believed that Christ was coming soon, that it was, it would be in our lifetimes. He said, well, I believe it's going to be in my lifetime. Well, why does he believe that? The man who rose from the dead said, you don't know. You just got to be ready. That's what I believe. Somebody else we talked to, of course, one of the books we wrote was about heaven and all God has done for us to provide a place for us to be in eternity, what he wants from us. And so a lot of people wanted to talk about heaven. And one lady came up and she said, yeah, have you seen that book, Heaven is Real? About that guy that went to heaven and came back? Well, we've heard of that book, and I think there's a movie about it too. You know what I believe about that? It's amazing to me that so many people can quote John 3:16. Almost nobody knows what John 3:13 says. John 3:13 says, no one has ascended into heaven but he who came down from heaven. That is the Son of Man who is in heaven. That's what I believe about that. If you want to know about heaven, you better listen to the only one who's been there, come here to tell us about it. This morning, I know I'm talking to a group of people who truly believe that Jesus rose from the dead. And I pray that each and every one of us will enable that faith in the resurrection of Christ to compel us to believe and obey everything that he's asking us to believe and obey. There is the power of the resurrection of Christ in my life and in yours. To know that it's all true. It all has to be true. It's all worth believing because the one who came back from the dead said it was so. And I may be talking to somebody even this morning who, well, you think you're saved even though you haven't been baptized for the remission of your sins. Or maybe you know what that stuff says in the Sermon on the Mount in Matthew chapter 5, but that's not how you're living your life because you haven't been believing it. Won't you turn? Won't you believe what was said by the one who came back from the dead?